Humility and God? I used to think that went in one direction, that we humans need to have humility before an all-powerful divine being, but what if there's something divine about humility and something humble about divinity? I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. I've been exploring the opening 18 verses of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, through the lens of what I see to be 4 concentric rings, wound around a central pearl in the center. Here's a quick recap. The first ring in that structure, verses 1, 2, and 18, revealed 4 aspects of the heart of the divine nature, and I coined my own words to capture what I think John is saying, that the divine nature is towardsness, into-ness, embraceness, and openness. The second ring, verses 3 to 5 and 16 to 17, revealed the meaning and nature of life and the paradoxical relationship between the universal availability of the divine life on the one hand, and on the other, the way that this life was made available in a particular time and place and person. In addition to comparing the universal and particular ways that life is available to everyone, John also compared 2 of the particular ways that life is available. One of those particular ways that life became known was a sacred text, the Torah of Moses, and thus the religion that we know of as Judaism today, which John said is a gift from the divine. And the second particular way that life has been made available was a person, Jesus. While the Torah is a gift given by God through Moses, John says that through Jesus there has been what I called an activation of grace and truth. As we'll see as we go, this comparison of Jesus and Moses has a lot of implications for how John would suggest that we understand and engage with religious heritages and sacred texts more broadly. The next episode will go into this more fully, but in short, I think we could conclude from John 1, 1 to 18 that the sacred histories of humanity are gifts from the divine. They've been given to humanity from the light that John says illuminates everyone. We may choose to agree or disagree with John on this, of course, but I want to be sure that I'm clear about what I think he's saying. At any rate, all of this is going to come up again in the next ring, which I'll take up in the next episode. However, as I often do, I am getting ahead of myself. So back to the focus of this episode, which I've called Ring C, and it's the ring that includes verses 6 through 8, and then verse 15. And I've titled this ring, The Witness of John the Baptist to the Divine Life and Light. I'll put the Greek text of it in the description of this episode, but here's my English translation. It came about that there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness in order to bear witness concerning that light, so that through him everyone might believe. He himself was not the light itself. He came as a witness to the light. Then it skips to verse 15. John bore witness about the Word made flesh. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I meant when I said, 'Someone is coming after me, who has come to be prior to me, because he was before me.'" As usual, I'll take things up clause by clause and word by word. So first, there came to be a man sent from God whose name was John. And let me take that first portion. There came to be a man. The verses in Ring C contain several firsts in the Gospel of John. When we read the text in its linear sequential fashion, rather than through the lens of the rings as I've been doing, this is actually the first mention of a particular person or or anything for that matter, being singled out as coming into existence. Prior to this, there was mention that all things came to be using this same verb. But here it's just one thing, namely one single human being. However, there is an unexpected word choice in my point of view that goes with this. I might expect that John would have said, a man came, etc., or even just, there was a man, like once upon a time, there was this guy. But John does not say that this man just came along or arrived, as the phrase, there came a man, would have implied. And John doesn't say there was a man. He seems actually to reserve that verb, the verb was, for speaking of the divine in these early verses of his work, at least this earliest section. No, this man came to be, John says, in the same way that all things came to be, same verb. His coming into existence is a particular example of God's creative work in the entire cosmos. Thus, in prior verses, we saw that all things and all humanity came to be, the Greek word ἐγένετο. But now there is this hint that at the same time, each thing and each human comes to be, ἐγένετο, through the creative divine initiative, which suggests to me that the creation was not just a one-time event which set in motion a chain reaction, but rather that while there was in John's understanding a beginning of everything, an initial creative beginning point for which the verb ἐγένετο is used in John, it came to be, each human being also comes to be as a result of direct creative initiative of the divine, including you and me, and of course this particular human that John is introducing us to. There's more to say about this person who came to be. First, he was sent from God. This is another first, namely the first mention of a theme that is actually quite frequent in John, the theme of sending. The noun form of that word, sending, is, of course, the noun sent one, or someone who is sent. It's the word from which we take apostle, which might make people think of the apostles, like a special group or an official role. But in John, there's actually many who are sent, and thus many apostles, sent ones. John the Baptist is, well, we're going to find out he's John the Baptist, is one of those sent ones, this man that John is talking about. And then there's Jesus. Jesus didn't just send apostles, he was an apostle. There are the disciples of Jesus, whom we normally think of when using this phrase. And then there's a rather odd reference to the Holy Spirit being sent. In other words, a sent one, in other words, an apostle. Wait, the Spirit is an apostle? Well, technically, grammatically, yes, because the Spirit is one of the sent ones in John. The mention of Spirit invites a little curiosity as it reveals another mysterious element in John's otherwise quite expected Jewish monotheism. I'm going to take a bit of a detour here, but it's connected to John's view of the divine being, and it adds to what we saw in the initial ring, the first ring. So I think it's worth the pause. Let me begin with a reminder about the way that John described the logos, or word, relative to the divine being in that first ring, because that's most pertinent to the point I'm making here. In reference to the logos, John says that God was the Word that was towards God. So the Word and God are not two, but one, though the oneness is complex and opaque. And as we'll see in the next ring, the Word that was towards God became human in Jesus. So in John's view, God, who is the Word towards God, in some mysterious way became human in this person named Jesus, according to John. Now bear with me. Elsewhere in John's Gospel, that Jesus is going to speak of a Spirit that will be sent by God. And as it happens, John also says that Jesus is the one who will send the Spirit. Then add even more to the mystery by saying the Spirit is also described as being Jesus, who is, don't forget, the human embodiment of that Word that is towards God and the God who is the Word. For example, Jesus will tell his friends, as a parallel comment to the mention of the Spirit coming to them, being sent by God, I will come to you. Then, too, there is the mysterious reference to the early followers of Jesus receiving the Spirit, in John's language, when Jesus breathed on them. In other words, his breath was apparently the Spirit. Now, let me try to make sense of all of that data. Here's how I capture this mysterious reality of God that's sort of buried in this phrase of the Spirit being sent. This mysterious reality of God and Word and Spirit in John, and I'll do it as succinctly as I can in 2 sentences. First, the Word is towards God, but yet God is that Word that is towards God. So, God is towards God's self. And now, the Spirit is sent by God, but yet God is the Spirit that God sends. So God sends God's self. God is towards God's self. God sends God's self. Now, these are not multiple gods for John. God is one. John is a monotheist. This is monotheism. But the mono and the theo of monotheism is mysterious and inexplicable. Maybe I can put it like this. The mono in the heart of the theos is a singular plurality and a plural singularity. Now back to the text and to the next clause. Finally, we're going to get to learn this man's name. There came to be a man who was sent by God. His name was John. It can be confusing because there's John the Baptist and John the author, and I'll try to keep it clear who I'm referring to when I use the names from here on out. Because of exploring the ring structure the way I am, we've come across the names of Moses and Jesus already, and it may seem like they were named prior to John. However, the mention of John by name is actually one of the number of the firsts that I'm observing. This is the first human being named in the Gospel of John if we read the verses sequentially. And I used to think that verse 6, just naming John out of the blue like this, would be evidence that John the author assumes the reader will already know who this John is. There came about a man sent by God named John. But I'm no longer certain of that. I actually think John is building up the story he's telling, setting the stage, and one by one getting all the characters introduced. In verses 1 through 5, the first character, quote unquote, is the divine being, who simply and always was. Then there was the coming into existence of all things, including all people. So the universe, the world, the cosmos is a character in the plot, so to speak. And then John mentioned life and the light that life produces. As the text unfolds, light plays a role much like a character in a plot, the role of enlightening all people. And I would add, so does darkness. Darkness plays a role like a character in the plot as well. And now the next character to be brought on stage is this specific, particular human being named John, about whom this ring C, is primarily concerned in both panes of the mirror, these verses 6 through 8, and then later verse 15, which we'll take up in a bit. Well, what else does John the author want us to know about this character, John the Baptist? And we don't know yet that he's the Baptist. I'm foreshadowing a little bit. Well, the first thing is he came into witness. He came into a witness. He came to be a witness. Here, instead of the verb became or came to be, ἐγένετο, the author does say John came. He arrived. He came on the scene. In terms of how John came into existence, John the author says he came to be. But as to why, as to the unique purpose for which this human being came into existence, it was to be a witness. This is another first. John, this John the Baptist guy, is the first person in the Gospel of John to be referred to as a witness. It's another word that is frequently used in John's writing. In fact, as with sending and sent ones, there are more witnesses than we might assume. There is this one, John, quote unquote, the Baptist. There's God, who is a witness in the Gospel of John. Jesus is a witness. The Spirit is a witness. The scriptures of what we call in the Christian world the Old Testament are a witness. The author of this text will be described as a witness. The disciples are witnesses. There's a Samaritan woman who's a witness. There are people who were healed miraculously who were witnesses. A woman named Martha is a witness. A woman named Mary Magdalene is a witness. And there are the miracles themselves, the things Jesus did that Jesus says witness to him. Begging the question, to what did all these witnesses, and now especially this particular witness, John the Baptist, bear witness? What were they bearing witness to? What especially here in this context are we to understand that John the Baptist was sent to bear witness to? John the author gives us two answers through two uses of the Greek word hina, or so that. First, he was sent so that, or in order to, bear witness to the light. Well, what light? Well, from the second ring in the ring structure, we would know that it's the light of all human beings, the light which flows from life itself. John was a very particular, singular human witness, among many other witnesses, to the universal light. Second, the purpose of bearing witness to that universal light, which is available to everyone, is, John tells us, so that all would believe. But believe in what? There hasn't been any explicit statement of something or someone to believe or believe in or to accept. The conclusion of the text here so far, if this is what we had, would be that John was sent as a witness so that all people would believe in the light that's already available. That's how the text would flow. The light that is already available and has always been available to all people. What John the author is saying here is that while light and wisdom and truth are as available to you and I as the next person, there are particular people who seem able to help us in unique ways to have access to or to experience and understand or know the light and spiritual reality that is always available to all of us. Like we saw with Moses in Ring B in the last episode, such people are gifts to humanity. But in the Gospel of John, Moses and John, who gets nicknamed the Baptist, are in many ways representing something bigger than themselves, the sacred heritages of humanity given to us as gifts by God. They represent religion and religions, which are in part at least a result of that light that flows from life and then illumines all people. There'll be more to come about this in the next ring. So this man, John, not the author, but John, who will be called the Baptist, was sent as a witness to the light so that all would believe in that light, that universal light. John has something more to say about John the Baptist and the light, and he goes on to that immediately. He says that he was not the light, but in order to witness about the light. John the Baptist, John the author says, pointed to the light, but lest there be any confusion, John the author wants to make it very clear he was not the light itself. The adversative but, quote unquote, in the text that the author uses to make the distinction between John the Baptist and the light that he is pointing to is actually the strongest option available to John the author in the Greek language. It's emphatic. John the Baptist is not the light. He is someone telling us what he knows, someone inviting others to look, to see, and to also know. Now, the second pain in this ring of verses, in verses 1 to 18, is found in verse 15. We've looked at 6 through 8 so far, but verse 15 carries on with this role of John the Baptist by giving us more specific content about what he said as a witness. The sentence contains 3 main clauses. He says, "After me, someone is coming." He says he came to be before me, or in front of me, or prior to me, because he was before me or prior to me. Now, those second 2 clauses use different words for the phrase that gets translated in English as before or prior, and I'll say more about that to distinguish them in just a moment. But let me take the first 2 clauses together. After me, someone is coming, and he has come to be before or in front of me. The first clause, the testimony, is that there was someone behind me, coming along, after me, chronologically. The second clause says, but now that person has gotten ahead of me and is in front of me, chronologically, locationally, as much as anything else. These 2 clauses are what I would call existential, experiential, historical, descriptive. But the third clause touches what I would call an ontological reality. It takes us back into what should now be familiar territory for us in our encounters with John the author, the mystery of being itself and of existence itself. And that clause is, he was prior to me. He was first of me. On the one hand, somebody was back there behind me, and now they're in front of me. That's the first 2 clauses, and those are what I've called existential or historical and descriptive. This is what actually happened. I was out here doing my thing. He hadn't arrived yet, but he was back there. Now he's arrived, and he's here in front of us. He's gotten ahead of me in the line. But this third clause is an ontological comment about the isness, the essence or nature of that one who's now, quote unquote, in front. The verb was takes us back to the way that John the author uses that verb to be, is or was or will be, in the opening verses, in the first 2 rings that we've looked at. John is saying that whoever this is, they existed before I existed. Now, based on the verses that precede verse 15, when we read John linearly, the first 2 clauses seem connected with the historical human Jesus. He was after John chronologically, in birth order, and in becoming a public figure. But the third point takes us back to something or someone timeless, to the light which, as we saw, flows from the life that was always, and to the Word that became human, verse 14, which is the Word that has always been and always will be, the God who is the Word that is towards God. Now, what's the relationship of this timeless, ontological wasness of the divine and the within time existential isness of Jesus, who was a human being, whose humanness had a beginning point, whose humanity was not timeless? That's going to be very much at the center of the conversation in the next ring. But in this ring, John's Gospel has barely introduced the fullness of the witness of John, known as the Baptist, to whatever it was that has taken place in and through Jesus, which will be the subject, of course, actually of the rest of John's writing throughout the Gospel. From the bigger picture, given by a broad overview of those chapters that are still to come, I want to conclude this episode with 2 lines of sight about the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus in John's Gospel. And in the next episode, we're going to look more at the interrelationship of this human being Jesus and the timeless divine Word, which is God towards the Word that is towards God. But right now, I want to look at the way John's Gospel presents 2 lines of sight about the interrelationship of these 2 characters, John the Baptist that witnesses to this person Jesus, and this person Jesus who's getting witnessed about. The first line of sight John gives us when we look at things is from the angle that centers our attention on John the Baptist. In all four Gospels, this John is presented as a figure who in many ways represents the culmination of the religious stream associated with Moses. While he was a particular person, he also came to symbolize something bigger for the earliest followers of Jesus. He's sort of the second half of a bookend, as it were, to the sacred history which led up to Jesus. In John's Gospel, those bookends are Moses and John the Baptist. Now, I'm sensitive to the fact that my friends who are devotees of Judaism would see this all very differently. And I'm just trying to elucidate what John was saying. And in fact, there was already contention about this very point that John is making when John was writing it, when he was writing his gospel. It was a point of contention, in fact, already during the days of Jesus and of John the Baptist as well. What is the relationship of these two individuals to their own Jewish heritage? My aim here is not to referee all of that, but to describe as clearly as I can what John's gospel is saying, how John saw things, because it reveals to me how he understood what we call religions in relation to how John understood Jesus. To be clear, John's gospel did not only compare Jesus in relationship to the religious heritage of Moses and John the Baptist, but in John 4, he, alone among all the other Gospels, included a story concerning Jesus and a visit to the region of a people called the Samaritans, who had a related but very different sacred tradition and religious history to that of Jesus and his people. They were very much a different religious group. That visit culminated in an insight into how John presented Jesus' understanding of religion, his own and that of the Samaritans, and all of it seems to sort of combine to have application for how John would see all religious heritages. And primarily, and this would take a lot more explaining than I have space to do here, as gifts given to humanity, and yet something unique about Jesus in relationship to all that. Which brings me to the line of sight that John has when he draws our attention to Jesus. And some might take John's view of the uniqueness of Jesus relative to religion to suggest that John assumed that Jesus held a position of superiority. And so now I really want to explore this second line of sight because it challenges a bit of our assumptions. I want to look at things now from the point of view centering on Jesus in relationship to John the Baptist, because that will give us a window into how John, the writer, views Jesus in relationship to religious heritages. It also reveals an important dimension of John's understanding of the character of Jesus, and as we will see, the character of the divine itself. First, in the 4th chapter of John, the early verses, we're told that Jesus learned that the Pharisees, a religious subgroup of the Jewish religious heritage, had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John the Baptist. John adds a clause saying, in fact, it wasn't Jesus who baptized, but it was his disciples. And then the text continues, so he left that area of Judea and went back to Galilee. Now, we would expect John the Baptizer to be the one to defer to the light once it arrives, the light to which he was bearing witness. There's even something differential in the way that John presents Jesus here, though, in relationship to John the Baptist. It's not the way we would expect it. The fact that Jesus relocates when he discovers that it's become known that his movement is getting larger than John's indicates to me a sort of humility, a desire to allow John space, as it were, to be himself, to remain in his position and his role, not a competition. And then there's the comment that John adds that Jesus did not personally baptize. This too seems to me to be making the same sort of point. Jesus wasn't setting himself up in opposition to or in competition with John. He withdrew, and he himself didn't do the things that John was doing. There's a humility, even a gentleness in this, I think. And again, in keeping with the other Gospels, the Gospel of John clearly presents John the Baptizer in the role of one who prepares for or points towards the main character in the plot line. He's like the opening act, and not the band that everybody came to see perform. He's the warm-up band. And in that case, what I would expect is that when the main act arrives, Jesus, then he, the main act, would say, okay, thank you very much, here I am, move over. But it's not the character of Jesus in John's way of introducing him. And John 4 is not the only place we see this, by the way. It's in keeping with a larger picture of Jesus' character throughout John. He washes feet. He doesn't seek to provide evidence for himself or prove himself. And he sometimes withdraws at the very moment you might think he would seize a moment to make a much bigger impact or take a larger spotlight. There's a powerful example of this later in John chapter 7, in which Jesus' own brothers encourage him to go to a big festival that was approaching, saying, go, you leave this little backwater area you're in, get up there to the big city, get to Judea, so that all your friends and disciples all your fans, in other words, might see the works you're doing, because no one who wants to become a big public figure does it in secret. Since you're doing all these things, show yourself. That's in chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Now, they had their own motivations for this, but it's Jesus' response that I want to point out here. And his response took two forms. First, in verse 6 of John 7, he says, my time hasn't come yet. It's not here. So Jesus is content to let his time, whatever and whenever that is, come at its own pace. There's a patience that's evident in this. There's a sense that he's not grasping for attention. He's content to bide his time, and if quote-unquote fame is to come to him, then he's content to let it come to him on its own terms, rather than pursuing it himself. Second, in chapter 7, verse 10, we're told that Jesus does, in fact, then go to the festival after saying he wouldn't. However, he doesn't go in the way his brothers advised. In fact, they don't even know, and that's why he said he wasn't going, so that they wouldn't know. He went, we're told, not publicly, but in secret. In other words, even when he does go to this big festival, he goes quietly, not trying to grab the spotlight. He doesn't promote his show ahead of time. The author, John, is showing us who he experienced Jesus to be by comparing him with John the Baptist. And in spite of the fact that John the Baptist himself tells everyone that he, the baptizer, is the one who would withdraw, and that he, the baptizer, must decrease, that will come up later in chapter 1, it's Jesus who is the one who backs away and withdraws. He decreases himself, so to speak. John, the author, experienced in Jesus' life a humility and a patience, even deference. Now, we've already touched on the way that John understands that the Word, which is God, became human in Jesus. And elsewhere in John's Gospel, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Thus, for John, it's clear that in his experience, at least, in his understanding of who Jesus is, Jesus was a window into the divine nature. Jesus' words and actions and character were transparent windows into the divine words and actions and character, which means that the humility, patience, and deference we've noted here in Jesus are also qualities in the very heart of God. That's how John sees things. I want to pause here and add this ingredient that I'm touching on to the four things that I observed in verses 1, 2, and 14 about the inner character of the divine nature, namely, that the divine is towardsness, intoness, embraceness, and openness, and now I add humility, divine humility. On a backpacking trip in the high Sierra Nevadas, I stopped once to rest and eat something one afternoon, and I was pretty tired and beat. I had gotten older, and as I normally do when I'm backpacking, I was breathing into my soul the mountains and the sparse vegetation. I was above the timberline, and there was rugged stone and jagged peaks piercing a Sierra blue sky. There were drifting wisps of clouds floating across that vast blue. And there were also vast portions of the Sierras, by the way, where there's no trails, and as a result, canyons and mountainsides that have likely never been seen by human eyes, or certainly by very, very few. And yet there they are. Tiny flowers, scraggly trees, breathtaking peaks, and ridges of the sort that, in the words of John Muir, turn a person's blood to wine when we see them. They're all out there, regardless of whether they would ever be seen or experienced or appreciated or not. And what struck me in that moment, on that day, near the trail as I rested and snacked, was what I would call the divine humility, meaning that it seems to me that God had created all that exuberant abundance of beauty without any concern for whether anyone would see it, or any concern for having it appreciated, or for being appreciated, actually, for that matter. I was overcome not by the bigness of the divine, but rather by the divine's smallness, the humility, the willing to be unseen, invisible, and unappreciated. I've, along the way, hinted at the fact that the next ring, which I've called D, would have more to say about the relationship of the divine and Jesus, of the ontological reality of the divine being and the existential reality of a human being who lived and died in the first century of the Common Era. But right now, I just want to touch on that humility that I think John sees in the heart of God because he experienced it in the person of Jesus. The next ring is also going to address our human responses to the light that illuminates everyone, and to that word which was towards God, who is the Word which became human. Universally available, not universally welcomed. A lack of welcome, which is allowed to be expressed and to continue, I would suggest, due to this very divine humility we've just been reflecting on. So we'll come back to that next time.